Hey folks, welcome back to Fisher's Shop. This is part 3 of the Ultimate Table Saw Jigs series, where I'm going to build some more jigs that make difficult tasks easily achievable. Now if you haven't seen part 1 or 2, don't worry, I'll have some links down in the video description so you can check those out later. But in this video, I'm going to be making an adjustable circle cutting jig, a tenoning jig, and a jig that'll let you cut dovetails on the table saw. Now, if you'd like to build these things for yourself, I'll have detailed step-by-step plans available on my website, so be sure to check those out later. Well, we have a lot of work to do and a short time to do it, so let's get at it. The very first jig we're going to be making is an adjustable circle cutting jig. This will allow you to place a piece of stock on a pivot pin and make a series of cuts until eventually you're left with a perfect circle. There will be a slider that allows you to adjust the circle diameter size, as well as a small thumb screw that will let you lock it in place. This way you don't have to keep punching new holes when you need to cut different sized circles. The first step was to cut out a square piece of plywood for the base of the jig. Once that was done, I needed to find the perfect size for the runner. Something that would fit without any play but yet would still slide smoothly. And when I had it, I could space it up by placing some nuts down into the miter slot and placing the runner on top. Then with a little bit of CA glue, I could set the base down on top of it, using the table saw fence to keep it square. Once the glue had completely cured, I pre-drilled some holes through the runner and into the bottom of the base. Countersunk each of the holes, and then drove in some screws to reinforce it a bit better. At this point, I could begin to cut down the pieces that will make up the surface of the jig. After they were cut to width on the table saw, I could chop them down to length over at the miter saw. The sliding piece is then cut to width, and then I could begin to fasten things down. I started by evenly spreading a thin coat of glue onto the first piece and setting it into position atop the base while using the table saw fence to keep things in perfect alignment. And when I had it in the right spot, I popped in some brads to secure it until the glue dries. Then I just repeated the same process for the other piece. Next up was making the small locking block. I chose to make it out of walnut because, well, it was completely unnecessary. Then once I had it cut to width, I could finish cutting it down to size using my crosscut sled. I drilled a main hole for the locking bolt to pass through, and then followed that up by drilling 2 more holes for a couple mounting screws. I was sure to countersink them too, so that things can sit flush once all said and done. Now, in order for the locking block to work, I have to inlay a nut into the front face of it. I start by tracing it out, and then I could put it in the vise and chisel out a recess for it. A couple drops of CA glue and a squirt of activator, and that nut's not going anywhere. Then to mount it onto the side of the jig, I add some more CA glue, held it in place until it's snug, and then secured it in there with some mounting screws. I tightened a couple nuts down at the bottom of the bolt so that I could turn it easily, and then the locking block was complete. The next step was to drill for the location of the pivot pin. Then I counterbored the bottom just a bit so that the slider will sit flat once the pin is inserted. See, I thought it would be nice if I could choose the size of my pivot pin. Depending on the project I'm making, there may be times when it doesn't matter if there's a hole through the center of the circle. But other times, I may not want to have that hole showing on the top side. So with this in mind, I decided to make 4 different size pivot pins that I could easily interchange. Then by drilling a hole for each of them on the front of the jig, I could have all of them handy and choose just the right one for the job at hand. Next, to make it easier to use, I decided to add some indexing marks so that I could quickly and easily set up the jig to cut a specifically sized circle. I just used a knife, a pencil, and some sandpaper to make my reference line, and then I could start to make the rest of the marks on the jig surface. I worked my way down in half-inch increments, which translates to 1-inch increments in diameter sizes. I stopped making marks once I hit 2 foot 3 inches, but that's not the limit of this jig. The way it's designed, you could flip the slider, clamp it in from the other direction, and actually cut a circle over 4 foot in diameter. Alright, so let's see how it works. I pried off one of my neighbor's oak stair treads and cut it down to a rough square. Using a ruler, I can mark where the center is and bring it over to the drill press. Now I don't want my center hole to be seen on the top, so I carefully set my depth stop to keep me from punching all the way through. I drill out the center and then I head back to the table saw. Here I can remove the slider and then insert the pivot pin that's the right length for this piece. Sizing it for an 8-inch circle and locking it into position. I drop the piece down on top of the pin, give it a few obligatory spins, and then raise the blade up. First, I start by taking off the 4 corners to remove the bulk of the waste. At this point, it's an octagon, and I can cut off all the points. Eventually, I can make real small rotations and just nip off any of the material that still sits off the edge of the jig. And once I have it close enough to a circle, I can move the piece up next to the blade and gently spin it. This lets the saw clean up any imperfections and gets it perfectly round. And there you have it, a perfect 8-inch circle. And what's nice is that the unsightly center hole doesn't go all the way through. It's a really fast and easy way to make a ton of wooden frisbees. Alright, I better get this back to my neighbor. The second jig I'll be making is a tenoning jig. This is very useful when it comes to cutting tenons, bridle joints, or even for holding pieces vertically secure for those cuts that would otherwise make you wet your pants. It rides along your table saw fence and has embedded T-track with a movable vertical fence that can even tilt to secure pieces for an angled cut. So the first thing I do is to hold my tape measure in random locations and measure the air. Then I walk away because I have no friends. The height and width I decided to make this jig is pretty arbitrary. I just chose something that wasn't so big that I'd have a hard time storing it, but yet big enough to tackle some decent sized projects. I realize that just about every table saw is a bit different, so when you make this one, you'll have to cater it to your saw and size it appropriately for yourself. I cut out the main vertical piece for the jig and give it a clean edge on both sides. Next, I could put in my dado stack and plow a couple channels through the main surface that will accept some T-track. Then I cut down a couple pieces to the right length using my angle grinder. I mixed up a pile of snot real good and then used a stick to dribble it down into the grooves. And once it was evenly coating the whole thing, I could lay a piece of T-track down and send it home with some percussive persuasion. And then I drove in a few screws for good measure. Next was cutting the pieces to use that will make the jig straddle the fence. I make a mark on the main face where the cross piece goes, and then I drill out some mounting hole locations. Then by flipping it over, I can countersink those holes so that the mounting screws sit just beneath the surface. Now to put them together. I just set them in place and clamped them to one another as I drove in some screws. Squeezing it against the fence like this will also ensure a tight fit and should make it perfectly sized for your table saw. I put on a piece of tape against the fence just to give the jig a little room so that it would slide easily once fully assembled, and then I screwed on the last piece of the saddle. To add a bit more rigidity to the jig, I wanted to add some gussets. I cut out a piece of plywood and then I took it over to the miter saw where I cut out a few triangles. I glued in each one of the 3 that I made and I clamped them into place. These will add some strength as well as to help hold the jig square, which is especially important once you have your project piece clamped to the side of it and you're pushing it through the saw. The last piece to make is the adjustable fence. I cut down a piece of plywood and head over to the router table. I use painter's tape on the fence to mark the locations where I need to start and stop while cutting the grooves for the bolts to move through. I line the piece up to the first mark, gently press down until the bit cuts in all the way, and slide the piece to the next mark where I lift it up. I repeat this process and make several passes, raising the bit a little each time until eventually I plunge all the way through. Okay, now for final assembly. I double check that the jig sits perfectly square and then slide the bolts into the T-track. I place the fence over the bolts and fasten it down with the knobs. Now let's see if it works. For the test, I'll cut an angled bridle joint. I clamped the first piece onto the jig using some hold downs that I made earlier. Side note, the plans for how to make these hold downs are also included in the jig plans. I make the first cut forming the cheek of the tenon. Then I just nudge the fence out a bit and make some more cuts to clear out the waist forming the shoulder. For the second piece, all I had to do was hog out the center bit for the tenon to fit into. And now for the test fit. Well, I'd say that fits pretty good. The last jig I'll be making today is one that will help me cut dovetail joinery. See, I'm about as delicate as a hippo, and when you put chisels in my hand, things just don't end up going well. But with this jig, the built-in angles, the single runner, it's essentially 4 jigs in one. And it should let me cut most of the dovetails right on the table saw, minimizing the hand tool requirement. The first order of business is to make the runner. For that, I rip down a piece of walnut. Once I got it to the right size, I move on to making the base. And for that, I'm just using 1/2-inch plywood, and I cut it to length over at the miter saw. For the jig fence, I start by cutting out 2 strips of 3/4-inch plywood, and I chop those down to length as well. Now these 2 pieces, once sandwiched together, will become the core of the fence. See, it's just like me. It's going to start out thin, but by the time I'm done, it's going to be a lot fatter and it's going to look kind of weird. I pop in a few brads and then I clamp it up. While that's drying, I can put the runner onto the base. Since the base for this jig isn't nearly as large as the circle jig, I decided to let some of the runner stick out. I'm not sure if it's adding any additional support or not, but I sure don't mind staring at walnut, so I'm leaving it. I drill, countersink, and drive in some screws. And just to infuriate everyone, I chose to add a flathead screw as well. So the fence core dried and I added another piece of 1/2-inch on one side. I cut it slightly oversized though, so there was an overhang that needed to be trimmed off with the router. After that, I did it all again and I added another layer. Once it was all dry and trimmed to size, I could mount the beefy looking fence onto the base. I measured out where it needed to go and then I traced on some guidelines. I squirt on some glue and then drop it down and line it up as best I can with the marks I had made. But just to make sure I kept it in perfect alignment, I used a framing square against my table saw fence. Once it's looking good, I squeeze it in some clamps until it's dry. And when it was dry, I went ahead and reinforced things with some sizable screws. Now for mechanical effectiveness, as well as just the aesthetic look, I decided to go with a 1:6 ratio for my dovetails, which translates to 9.5 degrees. I cut out some triangles at this exact angle using both the miter saw and the table saw until I ended up with 8 that were perfectly identical. Half of these triangles got paired up with another and glued together. I sprinkled on some salt to keep them from sliding around, was very careful to get them exactly flush with one another, and then I clamped them up to dry. The remaining triangles got mounted horizontally. For the bottom ones, I spread some glue and then used a couple brads to secure them in place. The upper ones were attached in a similar way, but with just one brad to hold them while I clamped it in place to dry. Once the other triangle pairs dried, I could glue them down on the other side of the jig. I set my table saw to 80 degrees, just under the 9.5 angle, so that I could cut down some 1/2-inch plywood to skin one side of the jig. With the pieces in place, I could then trace the back side to see where they needed to be trimmed, and I took care of that over at the miter station. A quick bead of glue down the edges, and I could clamp on those pieces to dry. Next up was a final sanding, and then I was ready to make the inaugural cuts. Alright, let's test this thing. The first thing was for me to mark out where I wanted the pins to go. I didn't put a lot of thought into this, I just threw down some rather arbitrary measurements. I honestly was just curious to see if this thing would even cut the right shape. I drew out my pin locations and then scribbled on the sections that needed to be cut out. Then I traced a depth line so I knew how high to raise the blade. I confirmed the blade was at the right height, carefully lined things up, and began to slice away material. It didn't take long before I finished cutting on the left side and had to move the jig to cut on the right. Then it was just more of the same until all the pins were cut out. With that piece done, I could then hold it up against the other and use a pencil to trace where the tails needed to go. Adding another depth line, and I'm back using the pin side of the jig. Yes, I know I'm supposed to be cutting the tails, but first I'm hogging out the bulk of the material while the blade is still set at the perfect height. And once I can't remove anymore, I flip the jig to the tail side. I raise the blade up, line up my piece, and carefully remove the rest of the material from the sides of each of the tails. Alright, so at this point, I've got my tails cut, except you can see there's just a little bit of material here that I couldn't get with the table saw, right down here next to the bottoms of each one of them. And I'll need to clear that out with a hand chisel. But that's the only bit that the table saw couldn't get. So I broke out the chisels and I chopped out those little bits fairly easily. Wow. Nice. A little bit of sanding and that'll be perfect. I chopped it down to size, glued it up, and gave it a quick sanding. And here's how it turned out. Not too bad if I say so myself. It certainly was enough to get me excited to try them again, so I created another sample using some black walnut and ash. And these turned out even nicer. The jig really helps me get perfectly straight edges on my pins and tails so that I end up with some really tight joints. It worked great. Well folks, there they are. Not only did they turn out great, but they work awesome. And like I said before, if you'd like to build these things for yourself, head over to FisherShopOnline.com. You'll find some detailed step-by-step plans available there. Hey, if this is your first time here at Fisher Shop, I'd like to thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed the video, please give me a like and subscribe. And hey, how about a comment down below? Hey, thanks so much for watching. I appreciate it, and we'll see you next time. This is part 3 of the Ultimate Table Saw series, Jigs. Ultimate Table saw Jigs series. Ah, crap. Oh my gosh. Of course, she turns on the vacuum right now. That was awful. Holy crapskis, that's hot. Ow. Hey folks, welcome back to Fisher Shop. Oh, and my heater turns on. Oh man. Oh. This way. That's a failure. I gotta rebuild it. I made some design flaws. This whole bed is too high, so I need to raise this blade up to the absolute highest it can even go, and even then it can only cut this high on the jig. That's a problem. Plus, when I pushed it through the blade, it came out on the other side, and that's no bueno. So I gotta scrap this one and start over. Oh well, mistakes were made.